Good morning, boys. I hope you're all really looking forward to your big night tonight with all your girlfriends. Presuming you've got girlfriends or just friends. Maybe other friends, I don't know. You got any friends? Probably. I would think so because you're all nice guys. Anyway, I just want to go through this introduction we did because I know some of you missed it, and this is really good revision for what we've done in this topic, which you're getting close to finishing now, so we can go over a few things now that you might understand a bit better, hopefully, if you've been doing your work. And for those of you who haven't done your work, then here's a little bit of extra information for you boys. How lucky are you? Okay, so this is the issue, land and water management. As we have come to understand, we know that we haven't done the greatest job in Australia of managing our land and water. The Aboriginals, on the other hand, did a fantastic job. They did change things. I think that they might have had a hand in wiping out the Macrofauna, the very big animals, such as the giant kangaroos and marsupial lions and the diprotodon, which was a huge wombat-looking animal. Look it up if you're not sure what they are. We had some big animals and very large reptiles there were too, massive lizards that you might have heard of the Komodo dragon. We had lizards here that were bigger than that, but we no longer have very big animals in Australia. The biggest one is that were native animals. The biggest animal that we have in Australia is probably the red kangaroo now. It used to be the thylacine. Red kangaroos can actually grow quite big. Okay, so some of the things, these photos, blue-green algae occurs when there's too many nutrients going into our river systems, and that's because of all the extra fertiliser that's gone onto the land to fertilise crops, etc., and to improve grasslands for grazing. There's a lot of extra fertiliser, and because we've removed trees, there's a lot of erosion, and it carries off the nutrients with it and the soil, which gets into the water and puts a lot of extra nutrients that aren't natural in there, and the blue-green algae love it. They go crazy. And then the little microorganisms, little animals, feed on the algae, and they can actually take all the oxygen out of the water, a lot of the oxygen, which leads to something called eutrophication, where the animals that live, the native animals that live in that water, won't get enough oxygen and they die. That's especially the fish, for example. And this photo is showing what happens with dry land salinity when a lot of the trees have been removed and the water table rises to the surface, bringing salt with it, and dries, evaporates the water away and leaves the salt behind, unfortunately. And that happens also in areas that have been highly irrigated, plus probably all the trees have been removed as well. Not good land practice in the past has led to problems now, and some of those problems are only occurring now after, sometimes 50 years after the trees have been removed or over-irrigated. It can actually take a long time for the impacts. Okay. As we saw before, the soils in Australia are actually ancient and old and infertile. Not much rainfall in most of Australia. It's arid or semi-arid. The native grasses have very deep roots to get down to the water table. Introduced grasses have shallow roots because that's how they adapted in Europe. And so they have to have a lot of extra water to actually grow because they won't get to the water below. So if there's a drought, they'll die off. But when there's extra water, they survive, and the native Australian grasses can't. It's the same with all native species. They just can't compete with species that are adapted to lots of nutrients. So weeds can take over in a lot of areas, and I include some of the grasses that have been planted as weeds because they're not supposed to be here. As we said before, the Aboriginals been here for over 50,000 years, probably longer. They did change the landscape by the use of fire especially, which made a lot of the plants much more adapted to fire, but it has been unchanged for thousands and thousands of years while they managed the land using fire. It was a very effective management, and it didn't damage what had already been changed. So it's been unchanged for thousands of years, as we say. So that, as it says, their actions did not damage land and water resources. They didn't want to destroy what they knew they had to have to survive. And also remember that Aboriginals think that all living things, and all unliving things for that matter, contain their spirit ancestors. So they're very careful that they're not affecting their spirit ancestors in any way. And they try very hard not to kill things as much as possible unless it's to sustain their lives. So, for example, if they're making a shield, and this is making a shield out of a mangrove tree, they cut the shield out, but they don't kill the tree by doing that because the bark's still there. Okay, so everything they did was ecologically sustainable, which meant that it would continue for the future generations. And their populations never got too high. It was a sustainable population for the resources. A very good lifestyle. Native Aboriginals, when Europeans arrived, there were no fat Aboriginals because their diet was fantastic. They were very fit people. Okay, and these are some of the things they used to do. This is the same. This is just cutting a tree for the canoe, but the tree survives. And these are some of the water traps, fish traps in rivers that they use. These are really old at Brewarrina, that use a complex channeling system so that the fish can swim in, but they can't get out. They get confused. Some can, but not many. There's a little film if you want to watch it. Some native practices, traditional medicine. So when Europeans arrived, that's when the problems started. They cleared the land for agriculture and forestry. A lot of land degradation occurred, erosion, winds blew the soil off the top surface. So they wanted to grow crops and they wanted grazing land, so they removed a lot of the trees, and we've seen some of the problems. This is some of the erosion that occurs from doing that, unprotected surfaces and roots not holding the soil together. The soil's washed away and gullying occurs, which is not good because the soil can never recover from that. Then the salinity problem we talked about. These are the two ways. Dry land when you remove the trees, because now there's not as much transpiration, which takes the water out of the soil, so the water table stays low. Groundwater under the ground. There's salt in the ground, a lot of salt in Australia's soils because it's been covered by sea in the past and for other reasons. So this is what happens. When you remove the vegetation, the water table rises and brings dissolved salts up with it, and then that can evaporate, and there's the bare surface there which can evaporate away and leave a salt pan. It's not good. And this is the same thing happening but with too much irrigation, because those plants that have roots at the top surface, they want to water them a lot. The water table rises, brings the salt up again, same thing. And rainfall as well. So you're adding extra apart from the normal natural rainfall, and it's too much water. And that salt also runs off into the water system, river system, creeks and rivers, and it makes the water in the rivers really salty. In fact, by the time the water reaches in the Murray, reaches the Lake Alexandrina before it goes into the sea. It's more salty than the ocean is. It's how much salt there is in it. And this is some of the first little impacts you'll see of salinity, where the plants start dying off. Only plants that are highly adapted to salt will survive, and there's not that many of them that are native to these areas. They actually can plant some. There's this salt bush that they plant that cattle can feed on, which they're doing a lot of. They're thinking of using it for growing a lot of it in the areas affected by salinity, salt bush, because then they can actually convert it into biofuel, into diesel. But that's one thing that might be done in future. They're not really doing it yet. This is where it's really bad, where the salt, you can see the salt on the surface, and all the trees have actually died from too much salt, the ones that are left. So here's the Aboriginal ways. They did really well. Spiritual connection, as I said, individual totems for people, and they're responsible for the welfare of their chosen animal, their totem. Very sophisticated management. People thought that, well, you know, Europeans when they arrived thought that Aboriginals were backward, but they most certainly were not. And they say they weren't civilised. Well, they most certainly were. So to say that's just silly. Water's a critical resource, obviously, and we're not doing well. We've already seen what can happen when you get too much salt. We regulate rivers by dams, weirs, levee banks, floodgates to stop major flooding and to store water, but that can lead to lots of problems for native species. Two great examples are the river red gum that have to actually have floods for them to survive, and the Murray cod. If there's not a flood regularly, they can't breed. So they actually don't really breed in nature very much at all anymore, and they have to actually be bred in captivity to re-release, so there's any there at all in the Murray and other river systems. Okay, so we have had a huge thing. What we do is what Europeans have done. So we've taken for granted all our resources, and as I've said before, the main reason that when Europeans came, free settlers and ex-convicts, when they used the land, they were thinking about making as much as possible. The free settlers especially, the convicts tended to, they knew that there was no way they could get back, so they were probably better land managers because they knew if they stuffed it up, they wouldn't have the land. But the free settlers especially came in and really exploited the resources because they thought they'd get rich and go home. But not many did. They actually found that it was a great place, and by the time that they figured that out, it was a little late. So we've done all sorts of things to the waterways. We've put sewage in there. That also contributes to extra nutrients and all that runoff we talked about before. And we have a problem with our water. We chuck water out to sea every day in our sewage systems, which is a total waste. All that water could be recycled. It's one of my pet gripes. So people like to, conservationists look at ways to conserve the land and find ways to manage it more effectively. We have to be careful in Australia because there's so many impacts that are happening now, and because of things like global warming, climate change. Some areas could really suffer because of that. There might actually be areas where there's a little more rainfall, but Australia especially is very vulnerable to becoming drier, and obviously it's been hotter recently. You can see that. It's happening. So to all those skeptics out there, check what's happening with climate change. Okay, some of the responses that we can do. Individuals can alter their practices so that they're doing more effective things, like farmers. In the past, farmers might have actually ploughed down these slopes, but now they do what's called strip farming, which follows the contour, so the water won't run off as easily as if they're ploughing downhill. Even if it's a small hill, it'll lead to erosion. So they're careful of that. This is actually